Live. Welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel and our live stream lecture for Sunday. This is, what date is it? It is September 7th. Sorry for the late start. We usually get started around 4 p.m. Eastern, but due to football season and the importance of football games just starting, we got started a little bit later. As I pick a background for today's live stream lecture, we go live every Friday and Saturday for Q&As, and on Sundays it's the live stream lecture, and you guys voted, and you voted for ancient Greece. However, you're going to have to wait a week for that live stream lecture because due to unforeseen circumstances with the channel and the usual problems with some issues we've seen in some of the live streams, I'm going to overrule the vote. I'm sorry, I have that power. I'm overruling. I'm vetoing. You guys will have to get in Ancient Greece as your live stream lecture next Sunday because I've decided to put to bed once and for all the big issue surrounding Woodrow Wilson, the 27th President of the United States. The 28th President of the United States. I've decided to put that issue to rest once and for all so that we can move on like adults. But I hope you're having a wonderful Sunday, and if you're just joining us, welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, where we talk about Woodrow Wilson way too much, and today we've decided to talk about him for our live stream lecture. But if you like social studies, history, and the like, consider liking and subscribing, becoming a Friendly Neighborhood historian. Double tap that screen and all of that good stuff. Follow our short and long form videos. We have long form videos dropping every Monday and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and short form content every day. So I think you'll really enjoy it. This is the Friendly Neighborhood History, where we bring you history in a neighborly, amicable manner. We've been doing it for about a year and a half. I've been doing the live streams for just over a year. So I think you're all going to enjoy today's topic because we're finally going to get it out of the way, and hopefully after that, everybody will stop talking about it. But anyway, so sorry, I hate to overrule all of you. It's nothing personal, nothing wrong with any of you guys, but thank you for voting. You can vote here on YouTube every weekend for the live stream lecture. Next Sunday we won't be voting because I'll be doing the Ancient Greece lecture that you guys all voted for this past weekend. But today we're going to get this whole thing taken care of with Woodrow Wilson, a president that everybody loves to talk to on my live streams, especially to condemn and criticize. And I understand why a lot of people do that. And yes, I'm decided to become a typical fascist just for today, but this is not the Friendly Neighborhood Fascist channel. This is the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. And no, Green Bay did not have me sweating bullets. The Jets had me sweating bullets, but the Steelers prevailed. But thank you and welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. Make sure to like and subscribe, become a Friendly Neighborhood historian. Welcome to our live stream lecture. And without further ado, let's get started talking about the 28th President of the United States. Now, if you need context on what I think of Woodrow Wilson, please go and and hopefully I'm coming in clear. The point in the matter is this. Make sure to go and check out my video, my long form video, where I do a tier ranking of the U.S. presidents to find out exactly how I have felt about Woodrow Wilson. Now, if I were to update that, I'd probably put him a tier lower. I put him on the B tier, but I'd probably put him on the C tier, and I'll explain exactly why. I'm going to talk about his life, his legacy, his presidential impact, and why he is such a divisive figure in presidential politics. This is not going to be a hate lecture. And no, Harry, you don't get to use a veto override motion in the United States because you're a Brit. But anyways, if we could get the social media handles in the chat and show some love to my moderators, Rodolfo, Harry, and Hars will be here soon. And of course, Simon the Bunny, who do such a great job with his channel. And we got our members, Ozzy with his cool Nicholas I insignia. If you become a member, you can get that. Anything you give to this channel goes back into the channel to make the history much better for all of you, like our new lighting and sound system. So hopefully you guys are able to hear the microphone, and hopefully it's coming in nice and strong. I'm not answering questions until probably later on, but I am addressing and talking about America's 28th president, one of the most controversial figures, not just in American history, but in this channel for some strange reason, Thomas Woodrow Wilson. And yes, Woodrow Wilson is one of those presidents who does not operate and live by his first name. Stephen Grover Cleveland, John Calvin Coolidge, and Thomas Woodrow Wilson are some of those presidents. Hiram Ulysses S. Grant. But basically, Thomas Woodrow Wilson is born on December 28th, 1856. When it comes to the calendar, other than Andrew Johnson, he's born latest in the year. He's a Capricorn, for those of you who are interested in that. It's Capricorn, no? Or is it Sagittarius? It's Capricorn. He's a Capricorn, for those of you interested in that sort of thing. I have no idea what that means. But basically, Wilson is born in Virginia, and he is a child of the South. He grows up in the South at a very divisive time, as opposed to the previous two presidents, William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt, of whom I did a very fun live stream lecture on a couple weeks ago. You guys can go check out. Wilson, these guys who grew up in the North, Wilson grew up as a child during the Civil War in the South. His father was a loyal Confederate sympathizer, and Woodrow grew up as a Confederate citizen. He is one of only two U.S. presidents, along with John Tyler, to be a Confederate citizen. It's interesting. He's one of the many presidents who were from Virginia, as there's 8 presidents from Virginia and 8 from Ohio. But Wilson is a Confederate through and through when he's growing up, and eventually he will move north. He becomes a lawyer. He's talking about his background. He marries a woman named, I believe it is Ellen, and they get married, have a couple of daughters. Woodrow moves north. He becomes a lawyer. He becomes interested in jurisprudence and in lecturing and in professorial work. He keeps those old Southern roots to him. He becomes extraordinary. He's a very racist person throughout most of his life. He has very prejudicial views about African Americans. Obviously, he comes from the Confederacy. He's grown up in that. And Woodrow Wilson is an excellent example of a person who is a victim of their time. Just like you and I are victims of our time, and in 100 years, I want to be judged fairly on what I did right and what I did wrong. Woodrow Wilson is, in some ways, a victim of his time. However, he kind of exaggerates that entire narrative by doing things in the 1910s when he's president that no victim of his time would be doing, that no one in the 1910s would really be doing, and we'll talk about that later. So Wilson moves north. He eventually becomes a law. I think it's a law professor at the university, the famous university in New Jersey, Princeton University, one of the Ivy League schools. So Wilson is a well-educated, intelligent man with a great background. He has a young family. Things seem to be going well for him, and he's a man who's more interested in law and jurisprudence and in lecturing and in professorial work. He's not someone who constantly screams out politician. He is not overwhelmingly good-looking or charming. He is affable enough to get along, but he never strikes anybody as being overly wonderful or overly charismatic, and he will never be that way. He's not someone who is known for being able to get what he wants by working and negotiating with different people in different ways at different times, a la Lyndon Johnson, another very controversial Democratic president of the 20th century. Wilson's a little bit more stubborn, and he has a very rigid view. He's extremely principled, and he holds on to his principles for better or for worse. Basically, Wilson operates his entire presidency, and even before his presidency, on certain notions of idealism. He has a very progressive view of how the world should work. He basically believes that the government's job is to be involved in every sector of American life and doing everything that it possibly can to improve the lives of the people who need it the most, the poor, the marginalized, the uneducated, and immigrants. This doesn't apply to people of different races, but it does apply to those who are disenfranchised, especially white disenfranchised people. Wilson is also open to some of the ideas of the early feminist movement, of first wave feminism, of women getting the right to vote and certain things like that. However, during his presidency, he will put the kibosh on many of these ideas. He's definitely not an egalitarian when it comes to men and women. But he has these idealistic progressive views, especially for whites, but he also has this high savior complex, believing that the job of elected officials and of public leaders is to make America a great nation that does God's work in the world. So Wilson has this savior complex that believes that the United States is intended to be the nation that guides other nations towards peace, justice, and peace, justice, and the American way is basically what Woodrow Wilson could put on his tombstone. That's what he's obsessed with, is creating an idealistic America that serves all people in all sorts of different ways, but also charts a course forward for better justice, democratic rights, and freedoms for people all over the world. And he believes that that is what God has put him on this earth to do, that he is answering God's call and God's mission by promoting the United States. So that's something that he does. That's something that he does quite a bit during his presidency. It's to make the entire world as good of a place as possible for everyone else involved through the intervention of the United States in both domestic rectification and in foreign policy. And this is something Wilson is going to do during the first term of his presidency. He's going to focus on domestic policy. The second term will, of course, focus on America's involvement in what I consider to be World War II, what you may call World War I, what we can all agree to call the Great War. Wilson's involvement in the Great War is taking those principles of progressivism, but also better freedoms, rights, democracies, basically being God's mission, turning America into the mission field, America into a missionary for godly action around the world. And Wilson is obsessed with a religious view of almost like an idealistic imperialism, of taking the ideas that America has at its core and spreading them around the world because he believes it will make everyone else better because of that. This is an idea that will continue in different forms throughout the rest of the 20th and even into the 21st century from different American presidents like Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush. Different presidents will come up with different theories surrounding this, but Wilson has a very religious zeal for it. It's more of a religious message and meaning for him as opposed to previous presidents and leaders, and of course those who come later who have a much more politicized, secular version of it. Wilson believes this is God's mission for him, and it's God's mission for America. So that is how Woodrow Wilson operates during his presidency. But these notions and these ideals have been part of his repertoire going back into his days at Princeton, in his days of studying the scriptures. He obviously has a very complex relationship with religion. He comes from a Southern background. I believe he's a Methodist. I think he's a Methodist. But so he's got a marriage. He's got a law profession. He eventually becomes a professor at the University of Princeton, and is in that position for quite some time until eventually he decides to become. He eventually becomes the president of Princeton University, probably the most famous president in its storied history. You've got to give credit to Wilson. He is quite the academician. He's very successful in the academic field. He's very popular with the rest of the faculty, and once again, he has a very idealistic notion of the world. He's also captivated by social Darwinist policies, which is basically taking scientific Darwinism and applying it to civilizations, and basically saying that certain civilizations are more advanced than others, so they have the right and the duty, the God-given responsibility to equip these inferior races, nations, and areas with their own civilization and with their own principles. So he marries this American idealism and exceptionalism with a paternalistic approach to non-white areas of the world, which of course is a huge part of his racism. This is why after the end of the Great War he calls for independent self-determination and democratic governments throughout Europe, but says very little about what that could do for Africa, the Middle East, or South Asia, despite the fact that they had all suffered and died during the war too at the hands of the Ottomans, the British, the Germans, and the French. So Wilson has a very paternalistic view. He's definitely influenced by social Darwinism. He's interested in eugenics, as many academicians and academics and intellectuals are in the early 20th century. This basic idea that good races should breed more and have more children so that society and civilization will only improve, whereas less desirable races and groups that have been less successful should have less children. And this, of course, is obviously paired with the views of social Darwinism, the idea that the best society, the best race, the best civilization, the best ethnicity will last the longest and all the inferior ones will die out, and that the best civilization will win in the end. And Wilson believes the United States has its job to be the best civilization and export those ideas everywhere else in the world. So Wilson has very racist, very prejudicial views. They aren't completely out of the mainstream for his day, but he definitely is calling back to his earliest days growing up as young Tommy in Virginia in the Confederacy as a Confederate citizen when it comes to African Americans in particular. He has a more idealistic view of the Civil War. He definitely kind of subscribes to the lost cause myth, which is one of the worst historical myths in history, that basically the South was fighting a lost cause against the overwhelming power of the North, and the South were the actual heroes doing everything to preserve their way of life from change, and they lost all of their freedoms and values because of the oppression of the North and the freeing of the slaves. This is definitely a revision of history. It's not what the Civil War was about. It kind of poo-poos and minimizes the horrors of slavery and the demand to end slavery that Lincoln pushed through the entire, especially the second half, but throughout, implicit at the beginning and explicit throughout the rest after the Emancipation Proclamation, the need to get rid of the evil institution of slavery in America. So Wilson has that lost cause myth. He has a Southern way of looking at things, and he has an idealized vision of the Confederacy and of the ex-Confederates who became KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, in the 1860s and 70s, and that's going to deeply influence him when he becomes president. So you mix religious fervor with idealistic notions, social Darwinism, and racism, and you get Woodrow Wilson as a person. These are his own beliefs about these different ideas. But Wilson's not a politician. He has no real experience, but in 1908, he is elected the governor of New Jersey. He's obviously the president of New Jersey's most famous institution, the Princeton, and he has name recognition now throughout much of the country because he's the president of an Ivy League institution who has now entered politics and become the successful governor of one of the largest states, one of the most well-known states in the North. He's likable, but he's not overwhelmingly charismatic. Wilson will always be one of these presidents who's more of seen as an intellectual academic than he is as a more of an idea man than he is as the charismatic. He's more of a James Madison than a Thomas Jefferson. He's not quite an Obama with a charisma. He's not quite a Reagan with a charisma. Not quite a John F. Kennedy. But he loves to give speeches. He loves to make demands. He acts, especially during his presidency, as if he were no different than any of the presidents I just mentioned when it comes to charisma, charm, and the ability to get things done. And in some ways, he's actually very successful at carrying out his agenda. Now, when I say a president is successful at carrying out his agenda, that is not a ringing endorsement of the president. Presidents are judged on the results of their agenda. However, if a president doesn't get his agenda done, he is usually seen as a complete and total failure. Woodrow Wilson is seen as successful by a lot of historians simply for the fact that he got his agenda done during his presidency with huge, steep opposition from Republicans in Congress. So there's something very important to see here with Woodrow Wilson. He's good at getting his agenda done. That doesn't mean it's the agenda you necessarily want to see. Love him or hate him right now, President Trump has been extremely successful in his second term so far at getting his agenda through. However, that doesn't mean the agenda is beneficial for Americans, and many would argue that it's deleterious to many Americans and many people in America and throughout the rest of the world. So, love him, hate him, or whatever you think about Woodrow Wilson, and everybody in this channel seems to hate him, there's a lot to say about the ability to get things done that makes Wilson a pretty effective president, at least in completing his agenda. I have to use all of these qualifications about Woodrow Wilson for those of you who are just joining us for our live stream lecture for the first time every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern, because this channel goes crazy if I ever say Woodrow Wilson did anything good whatsoever or accomplished anything, because apparently hating Woodrow Wilson is the coolest new thing that people do to pass the time. And I was going to do a live stream lecture on the ancient Greeks. That's what people voted for, but I was so frustrated yesterday because everybody kept bringing it up that I decided I would get it out of the way and then we would stop talking about it. Of course, people will continue to bring it up because people want to cause trouble, but I want to get Woodrow Wilson out of the way today, okay? Please at least respect that. I am giving you what you want. Next week we will do the ancient Greeks. I'm looking forward to that one as well. And if you're just joining us for the first time, this isn't about you. You didn't do anything wrong. Make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, though. So Wilson, the president of Princeton, one of the most prestigious universities in the country, then is elected governor of New Jersey. And he comes into office. He's a progressive. He's not an extremely well-known Democratic leader, but he is effective. And he's kind of a dark horse in 1912 when the Democrats select him. And basically any Democrat that got selected that year was bound to win because of the division between the Republicans. You have William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt having kind of this huge falling out and dividing the conservative versus the progressive sides of the Republican Party, so much so that Roosevelt runs the third term as a progressive Bull Moose Party candidate. This allows the Democrats to gain the upper hand, and Wilson, who is a progressive, who's a little more sympathetic to socialism, a little bit more on the left than Theodore Roosevelt, ends up winning the split vote. It would have been kind of interesting if Wilson had been running against Taft or Roosevelt at full strength. I don't think he could have ever beaten Theodore Roosevelt, and with Taft it would have been interesting. And by the way, for those of you who are asking questions, I'm sorry for not answering them. I'm doing my live stream lecture. When the lecture is done, we can get to questions. But Wilson wins in a pretty big landslide in 1912, but that doesn't really reflect the nature of the country. A divided Republican vote creates a big historical what-if. Would Taft have been gifted a second term by the American people? Would Theodore Roosevelt probably would have easily won his second term, but would have been president longer than anyone else if he had become the second president to win a non-consecutive term, and American history would have been changed forever because of what happens in 1914. Wilson is kind of an America First kind of guy in the sense that he's focused on progressive reforms in America. He focuses on doubling down on regular monopolies, breaking up trusts, producing workers' rights. I think he's the one that gets the first major child labor laws passed in the United States. So his focus for his first term especially are more domestic. He also succeeds in creating a national banking system, which has basically not existed since Andrew Jackson, who was the first Democratic president, destroyed it in the 1830s. His national banking system will be through a private organization that is not necessarily controlled by the federal government or the president or the executive branch or the Department of Treasury. And that is, of course, the creation. By the way, two huge amendments come into the Constitution around the time Wilson takes office. The 16th Amendment, which is the income tax, and the 17th Amendment, which is the direct election of senators. So the country has become more open to progressives who want to increase franchise rights and voting rights for different types of people. And so Wilson kind of comes in this as a progressive, riding the progressive coattails. Obviously, America has shifted hard and embraced a lot of progressive things that have been able to clean up working places, improve rights for workers, wages, break up trusts, and monopolies, create better competition in the market, thanks to Theodore Roosevelt and even Taft. But so Wilson's kind of riding that wave when he comes into the presidency. He creates the National Reserve. He's very happy when he originally becomes president. This is a bad picture, but it shows him and Taft is laughing because Taft got to leave because Taft hated being president. But unlike Taft's wife, who was obsessed with the White House, Wilson's first wife is a little bit more subdued. Ellen is very quiet, and she gets really badly sick during his first term. I think she dies in his first year of his presidency. And this absolutely horrifies him. It's a huge blow to him. He's extremely sad. He's lost his wife. And so that's a huge loss for him. He doesn't have Ellen around. I think it's his daughter or a friend of his daughter or someone introduces him to Edith. Edith Galt, I think is her name. And they get married, and they marry the next year. So Wilson's able to, I think, or 1915, and he's able to marry. He's the first president to be married twice. Or no, he's only I think he's the second president to be married twice. Maybe the third. But he's married to Edith Wilson, who becomes one of the most progressive and hardworking first ladies in American history. Check out my series on Patreon to learn about the first ladies, where if you sign up and join and become a member there, you can learn all about America's first ladies. I'm almost done with that. I only have four more first ladies to go. Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. But yes, so you got Edith Wilson. She's going to become much more invested in the political side and the domestic issues. She's going to pressure him to support women's rights and the right to vote. Wilson is going to hesitate greatly about doing this. He's going to arrest women's marchers and suffragettes such as Alice Paul. This repression of suffragette rights comes back to bite the Democrats badly. In 1920, the 19th Amendment becomes part of a constitution which allows women the right to vote, and a few months later, the women overwhelmingly vote for Warren Harding, allowing the Republicans to take back the White House. So Woodrow Wilson wins an election pretty decisively and has a mandate to continue progressive policies, as most Americans, either Democrat or Republican, seem interested in doing that. He starts that off. He suffers personal tragedy. He gets remarried. He's got a very loyal, hardworking wife who's very, very committed to his work. So there's a lot going on there. And then after so he wants to be a domestically focused president, but 1914 will change everything for the United States and the entire world. Franz Ferdinand, the German heir to the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is killed in Sarajevo, and Austria-Hungary puts pressure on Bosnia to turn over information regarding the assassin. Serbia. They'd already taken over Bosnia. Serbia is upset because Bosnia is controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the assassin Gavril Princip is eventually turned over, but the Austrians are not happy with the lack of effort from the Serbians. So they decide to go to war with Serbia. This immediately brings Russia to the defense of the Serbs. The Germans back up Austria by attacking Russia, which they know will bring France, Russia's ally, into the war. So you've got France and Russia trying to help Serbia against Austria-Hungary and Germany. Germany goes into Belgium to get to France, immediately begins one of the worst repressions and oppressive occupations in human history that we don't know about. The British are horrified at this, and surprisingly to the Germans, decide to defend Belgian neutrality and join the war with France and Russia. So a year later, the Ottoman Turks and the Italians will join the war, the Italians breaking their agreement with the Austro-Hungarians and Germans and helping France and Great Britain. Well, the Austro-Hungarians will fight the Italians in the area between Austria and Italy, and the Ottoman Turks, trying to regain some of their lost glory, especially in North Africa, will fight against the British colonies there. African colonies are fighting. And basically, anywhere there's a colony, you can expect the colonials from that area to go and fight for their colonial overlords, the British, the French, and the Germans. So there's a divided attitude about the war in the United States. Basically, a lot of people want to stay out of the war, but other people have different attitudes. There's a large contingent of German Americans that are very interested in keeping the United States involved, are aiding the Central Powers, as they are called, Germany and Austria-Hungary. But America's close relationship with Britain, obviously its shared culture, and Canada's obviously helping the British, they're still a colony, makes a lot of people sympathetic to the British and to the French side. So there's pressure on Wilson to join one or the other, and Wilson, trying to remain focused on America First ideas, at least as he sees them, remains committed to overseeing America, only America, and gives kind of a tacit amount of support to the Allies. He doesn't want to join the war, but he is interested in the prospect of what the war could do. Could it remake Europe? Could it allow some of his ideas to spread? Could it increase America's influence? Britain and France are already starting to borrow munitions from the United States, and they're being secretly stowed away on ships. The German U-boats, the earliest forms of submarines, some of the earliest forms of submarines, target ships indiscriminately in what's called unrestricted submarine warfare. In 1915, they sink an ocean liner, the Lusitania, which kills hundreds of Americans. And despite the fact that ammunition and guns were being brought to the British on the Lusitania, the Germans are castigated for this and eventually call off unrestricted submarine warfare. They will bring it back a couple of years later, and this will trigger Wilson to get involved in the war. But Wilson at first chooses not to become involved in the war, even after the sinking of the Lusitania, trying to kind of toe the line between being involved in the war and not being involved in the war while showing some sympathies to the Allies is not an easy thing to do by any stretch of the imagination. But it is quite interesting that he receives a huge amount of criticism from Americans, even progressives like Theodore Roosevelt. If Theodore Roosevelt had been elected president, the United States would have joined the war in 1914. Who knows what Taft would have done? It would have been very interesting to see what Taft would have done in his second term handling a war. But Wilson wants to stay out of the war. He wants to choose neutrality. And as the war goes on and the horrors of the Western Front and the trench warfare seem to become more and more apparent as Russia, Germany, and other countries enter full-scale starvation, as the horrors of war are more easily communicated than they were before, the Wilson decides that this is going to be his huge linchpin for his 1916 re-election. Obviously, technology has been a huge part of learning more about what's happening in the war. Communications better than it ever have been. In fact, technology has gotten so good that moving pictures have become popular, and Woodrow Wilson in 1914, I think, becomes the first president to show a movie in the White House. This is probably his most controversial decision. He decides to show Birth of a Nation, once again lionizing and romanticizing the Old South from which he grew up, and glorifying the Ku Klux Klan in a time when many people, especially Northerners, especially people from New Jersey, absolutely hate the Ku Klux Klan. So it had been proven that the Ku Klux Klan was a terrorist organization and that only people in the South supported them, only racists would show them a lot of support, and even people who supported them, many of them did so tacitly. However, Wilson, wanting to once again rage about the lost cause of the South, decides to play Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's classic movie, at the White House in 1915, and this gets a lot of attention and a lot of criticism, as it rightly should. The Ku Klux Klan was formed after the end of the Civil War and was destroyed in its first form, but was already becoming more and more popular in the late 19th and early 20th century because of anti-nativist, anti-Jewish, or nativist, anti-Jewish, and anti-immigrant views, along with the anti-black views they already had. So Wilson glorifying them is a message that he hates about hating immigrants, it's a message about hating Jews, and it's a message about hating blacks especially. So this is not a good look for Wilson. He never apologizes for it, never recants any of these ideas. Wilson remains probably the most racist, or one of the most racist presidents America's ever had, and I'm judging that on a proportionality scale, not based off, because you look at what the early founders said, and many of their ideas were very racist in the early 1800s, as opposed to Woodrow Wilson, and having these views in the early 1900s after the end of slavery and after the 14th and 15th Amendment and the Reconstruction era. It's a pretty hardline view, and most American presidents from the 1880s until John F. Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower really get behind civil rights are at least somewhat in favor of the idea of civil rights. Only Woodrow Wilson and FDR really stand in the way of doing that. But presidents like even progressives like Theodore Roosevelt had been in support of some form of civil rights for African Americans. Wilson's going to turn back the clock. He's going to segregate the government. I believe he also resegregates the military. It's appalling. Woodrow Wilson has probably the worst record from a progressive, woke, critical theory lens you can have of an American president based on when he lived and how he was acting. There. I talked about how terrible his racism is. Can I move on now? Yes, I can. But let's get back to 1916. Wilson promotes the idea that he kept America out of a war. This is his call to action. This is his campaign slogan. I've kept you out of the war. I'm going to keep you out of the war. I've kept your sons safe. I've kept your brothers safe. I've kept your students safe. I haven't conscripted them and sent them off to die in France, Belgium, and Germany. I haven't sent them to die in Africa or in the Middle East. So I deserve another term, and I've kept America safe during that time, other than the Lusitania. So this is a popular message. A lot of Americans are actually against the war. Regardless, however, Wilson has kind of a mixed record. He hasn't been extremely over-the-top successful, and he never really will be, despite what many Americans seem to think. American historians who judge Wilson highly in their scales of presidents typically tend to look at him based off of his ideals and how wonderful and forward-thinking his ideals were. However, that is not how you should judge an American president, at least in my estimation, and the fact that he won a war obviously helps his stock no matter who you're looking at. If he had not gotten involved in the war, America had lost the war, probably a very different story looking at Woodrow Wilson. Wilson's going to do two very interesting things in his second term that's going to probably lift his stock amongst most historians, even a little bit with me. But despite this, and it's going to be because he breaks his promise and does a very disingenuous, that's how you actually use the word, by the way, about face. He gets reelected in a very close election against the Republicans and Charles Evans Hughes. He's going to continue to deal with a Republican Congress that is not going to be a fan of a lot of what he's doing, but he's just going to stonewall them and demand to get what he wants. In 1917, two things happened that changed Wilson's approach to the war. The first thing is that the Germans announced they will resume unrestricted submarine warfare. They are getting desperate. The British naval blockade has been starving their people. They also have decided that they will try to elicit support, worried that America will eventually join the side of the Brits, especially because of this. Their foreign minister to Mexico, a man named Zimmerman, sends a telegram, and a telegram is sent from Berlin to him. It's called the Zimmerman telegram. It's intercepted, and basically it is promised that if Mexico will attack the southwestern part of the United States, and if join in the fight of a war on Germany's side, and they win the war, Germany will make sure that they get back the Southwest and California. This is intercepted and is a huge red flag to most Americans who become immediately horrified by that. So Mexico's going through a turbulent time. They've had a longtime dictator die. There are roving gangs of different types of banditos roaming around. I'm not being stereotypical. I'm being 100% accurate. The most famous of these is a man named Pancho Villa, who consistently crosses over the border and raids towns in the southwestern part of the United States. So Wilson is aware of the banditos. He's aware of Pancho Villa, and when he becomes aware of the Zimmerman telegram, the pressure is on him, and Wilson does a very, very strict about face, not something you'll see from someone as stubborn as Thomas Woodrow Wilson, but the 28th president will not be on the wrong side of history. Wilson is also a huge believer in the wrong side of history. Yes, that's exact. Yes, Harry, I know, I was right. That's exactly what I said. So, but they want it. So the Germans wanting Mexico to enter the war if America goes to war with them and promising them back territory is obviously a huge red flag. Unrestricted submarine warfare means more Lusitanias. In the same decade as the Titanic sinking, obviously people are worried about large ships sinking and hundreds or if not thousands of people dying. So Wilson gets into the war. And he decides to micromanage it. He oversees everything. He creates the first real total war in American history. And he is slow on the ball to put John Blackjack Pershing, the most successful general on the American side, into the war. But he is quick to start rationing supplies, putting up propaganda pieces, and doing everything to involve America in a total war. The effort to create a total war environment will be extremely successful at getting America winning this war. You got rationing, you got men going off to serve, you have propaganda everywhere, you have demonization of your enemies and glorification of your own side. You have this idea of a cause that you are all fighting for together, a communal movement of warfare, and that you cannot win the war unless you do what you can unless the soldiers can do what they can on the battlefield, and you can do what you can to help on the home front. So Wilson has good generals. He gets probably a little bit too much credit for his success, for America's success in the war, but an American president who is president during a successful war will almost always get the credit for it no matter what he does, and a president who is president during an unsuccessful war will get condemnation no matter what he does, i.e. George W. Bush and Lyndon Johnson. It doesn't matter what happens domestically. War is one of the biggest judgments for a presidential administration. Wilson sees the war as an opportunity to spread that message of American exceptionalism, social Darwinism, and the Messiah complex to Europe, especially, if not the entire world. Wilson's a huge believer in democracy and self-determination. He believes that many of the countries in Europe, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, have not had a chance to determine their own fate and their own future. So because of him, and so he believes it is his God-given duty to inform the Europeans that this is what must happen, that there must be self-determination, free lands, and that the Austro-Hungarian Empire in particular, the different ethnic groups there, like the Croats and Slavs, deserve their own states and their own countries, rather than having a amalgamation under an emperor from the Austrians. So Wilson will eventually design a peace plan and propose it to the Europeans after the war is over, which is known as which is proposed at the Paris Peace Accords. The most famous one being the treaty with the Germans at Versailles after the war. And he will propose 14 points for peace and justice, including self-determination and democracy for many European peoples and ethnic groups, which will lead to the creation of new states like Yugoslavia and Poland, but also will demand a creation of an international, supranational organization that will be able to preserve peace, work things through diplomatically, and be ready to fight if things go southward. And this will, of course, become the League of Nations, which was ineffective, not because, probably not because it was a bad idea, but because it was not backed by the United States. Ironically, Wilson's proposal, one of his better proposals after the war is over, is actually turned down because and probably would have worked if America had been part of it. So one of Wilson's better ideas is something the Americans themselves don't participate in, although the British and French pick it up after the war is over. And of course, they have an empire, so their colonies are going to be subsidiaries of that anyways. Canada, New Zealand, Indochina, which is owned by the French at the time. So there's a couple of things there. Next, here's what happens next. The United States helps the Western Allies. He helps the Western Allies on the Western Front, kind of overwhelm the Germans. Trench warfare breaks down. The Germans' ability to grind the war to a halt in Belgium and France comes to an end. The blockade snaps them. And the Americans probably get a little too much credit for their involvement in the war, but it is true that the United States was a major player in the war. They're successful in the Germans make a couple of attacks. I'm trying to think, what was the last major offensive called? I think it's the Somme. It's either the Somme or Verdun, or it might be one of the others. There's 4 or 5 major battles in the Second World War, or what you call the First World War. And thank you so much, NC, for the super chat. I really appreciate all the support you give to the channel, and I always love seeing you here. If anything you give to this channel helps us produce better content for you guys, so please consider giving generously if you can, or becoming a member to get early access and all of that great stuff. Thank you, NC. Really appreciate you, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. And yes, that's how you get my attention during a live stream lecture. Usually you give a super chat. But so the U.S. gives aid to the Allies. The Allies need it. The U.S. also gives out loans that they demand the Allies pay back, probably with very little patience after the war is over. Okay, was it the Somme? Interesting. But basically the Germans crash into the lines, trying to break the trench warfare. Their goal has always been to get to Paris and knock the French out of the war. The American troops, along with British, New Zealand counteroffensive, maybe it's Aussie counter. I think it's the Aussies. The counteroffensive manages to be extremely successful. The trench warfare eventually breaks down. Pershing and the other field marshals, like I think Pétain is in this one, eventually lead the forces all the way into Germany, and the Germans eventually surrender on November 11th, 1918, which becomes known as Armistice Day. A year later, the Treaty of Versailles is agreed upon in Paris in the Hall of Mirrors, and so this is one of many different peace accords that take place in Paris at that time between the Allies and the Germans. So in the Hall of Mirrors, in this room here, I'm going to move out of the way just so you guys can see it. It's hard to get out of the way, but you can see Wilson. Okay. You can, let me see, that will do it. You can see Wilson, George Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, those are the French and British leaders respectively, and Vito Orlando, the Italian, as the Italians kind of get a bronze or silver star for their participation in the war. But America, having not been severely damaged by the war, having far fewer casualties than any of the other allies or the Central Powers for that matter, and obviously being extremely financially responsible for the allies being able to have enough money to produce the supplies and munitions necessary to win the war, is obviously in one of the more demanding positions where they can actually exert their influence over the entire convention. You have war-weary powers, you have winners and losers, and the winners want to punish the losers, and the Americans hold a lot of the chips, but not all of the chips. Wilson's foresight is probably what he gets a lot of his praise for. Wilson insists that punishing Germany will not lead to any sort of lasting, stable peace, and a lot of historians who buy the false narrative that because of the Treaty of Versailles, the next World War, the Second or Third World War, depending on your perspective, happens. By the way, I believe the 7 Years' War in the 1750s, also started by the Germans, is the First World War, in case you're wondering if you're new here. But basically, the Second World War ends with the Treaty of Versailles and several other treaties that in the Treaty of Trianon, for instance, that in the conflict with Austria-Hungary and with the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Never forget about Bulgaria. But the Germans basically have... the Germans are punished heavily. They're given a huge amount of war indemnity. And this sticks in the craw of the German culture. And although it isn't a prominent issue 10 years later, by the middle of the 1930s, the Nazis are running with this narrative to justify their own things. So when people, historians especially, make the argument that the Treaty of Versailles and the British and French bullying the Germans is why the next World War happened, when some people go so far as to say that the war just took a pause for 20 years, they are actually siding with the Nazis. That is the argument the Nazis made. The Nazis were the ones who said that because of Versailles, because of what the others have done to us, look at us. So Wilson, but aside from that, Wilson proposes his 14 points. Some of them are adopted. You do get a formation of a League of Nations. Some of them are not as popular. The British and the French basically tell Wilson several times, you can say what you want here, but when it comes to handling this, we are in charge. We're the ones that suffered, and we're the ones with the empires. You have kind of a minor little empire, and you might think that you're the big wheel in the house because you haven't had the suffering, and you're maybe the greatest power in the world right now, but you don't have the territory, clout, and history that we do, so know your place. So they kind of allow the United States to be the major at some points and minor at other points. This leads to the war indemnities and the war guilt clause, where Germany accepts the full burden of responsibility for the war, something that the Nazis will capitalize on 15 years later in order to seize power. Wilson believes this is a terrible idea, but he is happy about some of the results, especially the adoption of the creation of the League of Nations and self-determination in Central and Eastern Europe for different ethnic groups, which kind of is bungled with the formation of Yugoslavia, which is kind of shoving them all once again into one major country. But also he is happy about the formation of Poland and other states. He's happy about U.S. influence. The United States is wealthy, it's strong, it's politically powerful. Wilson makes a couple of big blunders domestically at this time. He basically allows the Ku Klux Klan to grow in large numbers. He allows kind of this rampant persecution of communists following the formation of the Bolshevik Party taking over Russia in 1918. A Red Scare happens throughout the United States, and people are indiscriminately targeted and mistreated who are not communists necessarily. Sacco and Vanzetti are a huge example, and this will continue into the very conservative 1920s. Wilson's not a communist. He's sympathetic to some socialistic ideas, but I wouldn't even necessarily call him a socialist. But he's no fan of communism. So once again, you have a repression of civil rights. You have the expansion of the Ku Klux Klan under Wilson. You've got a lot of flub-ups when it comes to the social justice scorecard for Woodrow Wilson that are pretty inexcusable for the most part during his presidency. Even with a victim of the time narrative, well, a lot of people would have agreed with him. Yeah, that's not necessarily a good thing. What happens next? Wilson comes back from the Treaty of Versailles, a hero to many Americans, but with a long list of demands. He wants the United States to accept the Treaty of Versailles, and that means the United States will enter the League of Nations and become a part of a supranational organization. If this had happened, perhaps Hitler and the Nazis would have been prevented from getting any further, and perhaps mediation would have been able to help. However, the story of the United States being shut off in the 1920s and doing nothing to help international peace is absolutely absurd. Look at the Dawes Plan, the Locarno Pact, and the Kellogg-Briand Treaty of 1928. The United States was far less involved in foreign affairs compared to having 100,000 men die in a war like they were from 1917 to 1918. But they were much more involved. They were involved in international peacekeeping agreements, stabilizing the German economy, and there is kind of an international connection that Wilson forms between the United States and Europe that will continue to last into the 20s and definitely get revived in his, you could say, his rightful successor, Franklin Roosevelt. So Wilson goes back to the United States with a list of demands, and Wilson is not one to shy away from getting his demands met. One of the big things that he is demanding is obviously that the United States enters the Treaty of Versailles. He has to, the Senate, according to the U.S. Constitution, must approve presidentially agreed treaties. It's a good checks and balance. It's a part of the checks and balances of a constitutional system. But basically, Wilson wants to drum up support politically for this, and he knows he's not going to run for another term, although he's interested in it. He decides to go on a speaking tour around the United States and put pressure on voters, to put pressure on their senators to vote for the treaty. The Republican Senate is pretty obdurate, but so is Wilson. But Wilson is insistent that he can get the job done. He tours around the United States, giving speaking engagements everywhere, and he's kind of running on fumes. He came back from Versailles and is doing this. He's doing what no president has done before. He collapses on stage during one of his speeches, I think in Denver, and then has a stroke a couple of days later. And this leads to one of the first big constitutional crises in presidential succession in American history. Not since the first president had died 80 years before had America really had this issue of what is happening to the president. This is a far less technologically advanced. There's no television, there's limited radio, and there's no Wi-Fi, internet, or social media. So obviously the president having an episode like this doesn't have as huge of an impact as it might have today. However, at the same time, Wilson is kind of kept in hiding for the next year and a half of his presidency. He never fully recovers from the stroke. He is debilitated, and his wife decides to play gatekeeper. Edith Wilson administers a lot of the duties of the presidency, working with her president to get things done. And in many people's eyes, she is the first female president. She is kind of doing de facto what Wilson does de jure. Wilson's vice president, Thomas Marshall, and Congress are left out in the dark, and eventually Edith comes forward and talks about the president's compromised state. He appears in public. He starts to rehabilitate. He's healthy enough to do a little bit, but unfortunately, his stubbornness has not subsided at all. The Republicans in the Senate have no desire to reward him. The American economy starts to stagnate after all of these wartime demands and economic needs. Those things slow down, so the American economy comes to a grinding halt. Wilson's policies of raising taxes and other things haven't really come to fruition the way he thought they would. And so Wilson's presidency ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. The Senate votes down the joining of the League of Nations. It's a huge blow to Wilson's agenda. It's one of the only major blows he's ever had to his presidential agenda. And he leaves office extremely crippled, extremely physically ill, and bitter that he hadn't gotten everything he wanted. And Woodrow Wilson is the kind of president who is mad if he doesn't get every single last thing that he wants. He's a perfectionist, if there ever was one. And so he leaves the office. His wife kind of had from the shadows run a lot of the things in the country for almost a year. Wilson was not his full strength, his full self, and there's a lot of lack, a lot of a second-term slump from Woodrow Wilson because of his stroke and because of the League of Nations deal. The result is what you see from a lot of second-term presidents who will become unpopular. Their party gets shellacked. It's the largest popular vote loss in presidential history in 1920. The Republicans sweep back into power and will completely turn the country in another direction. Woodrow Wilson is probably the first major Democratic interventionalist in American history who believes it's the job of the United States to be involved everywhere that it can be, and if it can spread democratic ideas, then what's the harm of getting involved in a war? This will, again, be perpetuated for different reasons by different presidents. You could call him a man ahead of his time in that he was a neoliberal who had this idea of the United States leading by example and promoting its ideals everywhere, and for that reason, the world will be a better place. Future presidents like Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Barack Obama, the Bushes, even Ronald Reagan will kind of copy from this in their own way and do their own things during the next World War, the Cold War, the creation of the United Nations, and the War on Terror. So, that's basically it for Wilson's presidency. He never recovers from his stroke. He dies 3 years after his presidency is over, and he's kind of at first kind of seen as kind of mediocre. Eventually, his legacy will become extremely impactful as people look back on history and realize the failure of the Treaty of Versailles to create lasting peace in Europe. Franklin Roosevelt's expansion of the progressive state and kind of going three levels beyond Wilson makes progressivism and government intervention extraordinarily popular in both the historiography of the 20th century America, but also in economic historiography. And Wilson himself will be highly championed as as a man ahead of his time who pushed progressive ideas domestically and leading by example and fighting for peace internationally. And in an America that became obsessed in the latter half of the 20th century with maintaining world peace, even though they didn't always do this and oftentimes contradicted themselves, during the Cold War, at least having this ostensible show of caring about democracy and self-determination, so much so that they forced Britain to basically give up its empire with pressure from the Soviets as well. Cold War policies, foreign intervention being the rage of the 1950s until really the 2010s, 2020s. you can see, even the 40s before then, you can see why Wilson's image became so popular as this idea of a man being ahead of his time, doing the right thing for America, because every time America intervened, it seemed to be doing something good. The fact that things went horribly southward from Vietnam onwards, with some small exceptions, shows that this debate is an ongoing thing. So Wilson was ahead of his time when it came to foreign policy and understanding how the global entities would grow, how global organizations would grow out of the most powerful countries on earth. And people, again, who were obsessed with winning the Cold War could look at Woodrow Wilson as a hero who had these ideas ahead of his time. And if only the U.S. had done that, there would be no Soviet Union with all of its power. There would be no Nazi Germany. To say that there would be definitively none of that is not true. The Soviet Union came to power when Wilson was president. To say that the Cold War wouldn't have happened, or that the next World War wouldn't have happened if the U.S. had joined the League of Nations and accepted the Treaty of Versailles, is a big counterfactual, but it's quite possible. You have to ignore the U.S. peacekeeping attempts of the 1920s, disarmament under Warren Harding and Kellogg-Briand, and other agreements under Calvin Coolidge. But at the same time, it is true that the Nazis stormed back into power and violated every part of the Treaty of Versailles, and Britain and France, both two very war-weary countries that had far more damage done to them than the Americans did in the previous World War, were very slow and hesitant to actually use military force to stop the German onslaught in the Wehrmacht and the Blitzkrieg that eventually went into Poland. So was Wilson right about everything? Absolutely not. Would things have been better in Europe and internationally and globally if the United States had joined the League of Nations? Quite possibly. And so that's where Wilson gets a lot of credit. He's a president who won a war. He's a president with interesting democratic ideals and some good foreign policy foresight. However, you've got to balance that with the racism, the mixed reviews and results of his domestic plans, the fact that his party was whipped out of power in a frenzy after he left office, and that many of his economic policies were revolved backwards in the early 1920s. So for people who are huge fans of progressivism, government intervention, and an ideal of supranational organizations, Wilson could be a model of an early primogenitor of many of those idealistic ideas. For people who are a little bit more isolationist, they definitely, or a little bit less interested in those sides, or more conservative, Wilson kind of strikes you as a failure. I think the president who wins a world war gets some credit for that. I think that has to be part of it. I also will look at Woodrow Wilson's racist beliefs and obviously take that into account. And so when I survey all the things, good, bad, and indifferent, the way the White House was after he left, what happened after he left, his legacy over time, the development of our understanding, our narratives, the way that historians have crafted the narratives to make Wilson some sort of lionized hero, I have to look at real clear F-tier behavior, such as showing Birth of a Nation, etc., and I have to couple that with real forward-thinking achievement, winning a world war, creating a supranational organization that, with the United States, might have been extremely successful, fighting for peace, understanding the importance of democracy in Europe. All of these things gives me a very mixed feeling at the end of the day. So I would say C minus for Woodrow Wilson. I judge him much harsher than the vast majority of historians who believe that he is one of the best American presidents. Many have him in the top 10, if not the top 15. I don't think he's anywhere close to there. I think he's middle of the pack. I have gotten more and more, and thanks to this channel and some of the people and my moderators on the channel, I've gotten more and more critical of Woodrow Wilson over the last, over the last couple of months. So I used to be even more of a fan of Wilson, but people have pointed out things that were definitely a problem with Woodrow Wilson that it's fair to criticize him over and give him flack for. Wilson, the fact of the matter is, when you criticize Woodrow Wilson, you are not only criticizing a president, you are criticizing an entire historiography that has a particular narrative with a particular goal that's very agenda-driven in mind. Historians like supranationalism, they like the ideals of progressivism. Those things seem to have worked in many different ways, and so because of that, Woodrow Wilson gets a pass for some of his more cantankerous behavior. He doesn't get a pass for being an absolute racist, showing Birth of a Nation, or any of the flub-ups he made with the economy in my book. So I hold him in a very middle of the pack position, only because I know what the historians say and I understand their arguments. I know what Wilson did right and I know what Wilson did wrong. That is a 50-minute summation of the life, legacy, and impact of Woodrow Wilson and his presidency. I'm done talking about it. I have been pressed on this issue over and over again to admit that he's the devil, to talk about how terrible he is. Harry doesn't like him because Brits are better than Americans, and Harsh doesn't like him because he's a liberal, or because Wilson's a liberal. I have a nuanced perspective. It's probably more moderate than a lot of historians who tend to lean towards the left and want to praise a president who had liberal ideas. But I think that Woodrow Wilson did some pretty good things during his presidency, but I also think he had plenty of shortcomings. Yeah. So he also caused the pound to crash and the bond market to be sold en masse, as well as a multitude of other things to make sure Britain went bankrupt. Yes, I know what he did. Basically would lose the war because of mutual exhaustion, because Germany was in a better position at this point, was going to let them win. Yes, Wilson allowed the American... Yes, Wilson won a world war. I know, Harry. I already said that. So I'm going to give about 10 minutes. He also immediately undermined his own Federal Reserve by basically demanding they declare Britain an unsecured investment place. Well, yeah, that's the American exceptionalism part of it. Wilson basically wanted the American money to be better than British money. That's why he created the Fed, and that's why he tried to undermine the British markets. He saw an ability to put America at the financial tip-top during his presidency, and I would argue that by 1921, America is the tip-top economy in the world because it isn't devastated by the war the way Britain and France were. So, yes, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. Oh, for goodness sakes. They would not want me to ever speak for them because I'm too harsh on him, and then other people wouldn't ever want me to talk about him because I'm too nice to him. So, yes, anyways, I've done it. I've talked about Woodrow Wilson. We've gotten this out of the way. He will not be a poll option. If somebody's new and they want to ask me about Woodrow Wilson, I'll answer questions. But please, just to my moderators and to loyal, friendly neighborhood historians who are always here, I appreciate you all so much. Can we stop talking about him? Where's the Trump line when I need it? Are we still talking about Woodrow Wilson? I'm done. I've talked about Woodrow Wilson. I've given you the history. You can make up your own judgments about Woodrow Wilson. I have my own opinions. I shared those opinions. I shared the justification for those positions. It is not easy to be an objective and fair-minded historian in any sort of a matter, but when you're on YouTube and the internet and social media, it gets a lot harder, and I'm finally given a fair and balanced objective perspective on a president who is way too lionized in the regular media and is way too hated in this chat for some reason. But anyways, yes. So we've learned Woodrow Wilson's story. If Harsh isn't here today, if he wants to watch the lecture and get into all of that, then he can. You can watch the lecture and learn a little bit more about Woodrow Wilson, and maybe something he didn't know before, even though he thinks he knows everything, like some of my other moderators do. But oh well. Oh, and by the way, this is okay. Isn't this working? Yeah. This is the Peace Congress. This is a banner or a pamphlet of June 28th, 1919, the meeting at the Versailles. So I'll keep this as the background, and I will take about 10 minutes now and answer any questions you have about history or social studies, giving you guys a little bit of a Q&A at the end. Hopefully it's more peaceable because I finally got this monkey off my back of Woodrow Wilson. You're allowed to think whatever you want about Woodrow Wilson. You're allowed to have your opinions about Woodrow Wilson. I have shared mine. I have given argumentation as to why I believe that. If you want to ask me a question about it, I'll still feel a question about it today. But going forward, please do not bring him up anymore because I am getting tired of having to talk about him every single live stream. Nobody does this with any other American president except Trump because he's the current president, which is somewhat acceptable, I guess. Anyways, Joe Biden has been out of office for 7 months, and he doesn't even get brought up every single live stream. But someone always wants to trash Woodrow Wilson, which I don't think is fully fair, but I understand that you are reacting to a mainstream media and historical narrative that makes Woodrow Wilson a great president when he wasn't a great president. But he is not. But that doesn't automatically... Here's a lesson in critical thinking. Someone not being great doesn't mean they're automatically terrible. Someone doing something bad doesn't mean everything else they did was wrong too. And someone doing something good doesn't mean that everything else they did was good as well. There. You've now learned critical thinking from the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. A history channel on YouTube is how you've learned critical thinking in the year 2025. Please, if you didn't know this before, please reconsider your educational career. There you go. Germany could have won World War I, or what I call World War II. Probably. Would have been interesting to see getting the Soviets out of the war with the Americans not joining. What would have happened? Yes. I've always been curious because the German home front was kind of collapsing at that point. Yeah, it would have been... It's a fascinating counterfactual. What about James Polk? People can still talk about James Polk. I'm not fully worn out on him, but I'm sure I'm going to have to do a live stream lecture on him soon because apparently everyone hates him too, even though he's a much more successful president, in my opinion, than Woodrow Wilson. Would the Entente have won without U.S. intervention? Again, it's a tough question. I think I'd say it's about 60-40 yes, but I just don't. I look at it and I say to myself, there's a real good chance that Germany would have broken their lines down with an offensive without American help there on the ground. The Austro-Hungarians were collapsing, but with Russia out of the war, that would have given huge amounts of relief. At the very least, they would have been able to win in Europe. Africa and the Middle East were lost by that point. Germany lost 2 world wars. Imagine being those guys. Actually, they won one. They won the first one. The Prussians did. Did the Zimmerman telegram carry any real threat of America being invaded? What's the general public's reaction? They felt that it was as close to a declaration of war as possible. And Wilson was under tremendous pressure to join the war afterwards. Germany should have tried it again in 99. 3 nil in 1 century, but 3 in 1 century. Then again, 2 shots of the world title. Got to respect that. Yes. As Norm MacDonald says, Germany, be afraid of Germany. They went to war with the world. And then after losing, 20 years later, they went to war with the world again. So, hello, Faraz. Good to see you. Let me see. I'm just going through the chat here, seeing who's still here. Frog Lover, good to see you. Mr. Clean, always a pleasure. I saw somebody, Spanish flu, 100,000. Yep, that was pretty bad. People didn't talk about that as much as they should have. Empires collapsed. The Ottomans, the Russians, the Germans, the Austrian, Hungarian. Yep. Let me see. Junod was asking about the Boston Tea Party. That's where a bunch of colonists threw tea into Boston Harbor, protesting the British refusal to get rid of the tea tax in 1773. It's part of a response to what's called the Tea Act. You're welcome. The original Joe Biden. Yeah, a lot of people have said that Joe Biden is pretty familiar. I don't think Trump had a stroke. Please. Wilson's son-in-law is Klan. I'm not surprised. Oh, this is what I saw. Joey was asking about stuff. He was asking about me talking what I should talk about, which got my attention. Inbreeding hillbillies, gringos, gabachos, Europeans don't bathe and brought diseases. Talk about that. Yes, the European diseases killed a large number of Native American tribes. Here's something else the Europeans brought that Native Americans didn't have, and that's the wheel. And horses. And cities. Well, they did have cities. But so if you're going to talk about the bad things the Europeans brought, I'm going to immediately think about the good things they brought. And if you're going to talk about the good things they brought, I'm going to immediately think about the bad. People who only have one view of history have decided to ostrich head themselves so bad that they can't think straight about anything regarding history. So Joey, I think this is the first time we're seeing you. Thank you for telling me to go back to Europe. I'm not from Europe. I'm from the United States. Thank you. I always appreciate some good anti-European racism on the channel. It's always fun to see that. And I'm speaking American. So there you go. Joey, if you're still here, thank you for showing us more about yourself than about the history you're talking about. That's what happens when somebody decides to load history with their own narratives. That's what ends up happening. That's why I'm here. That's why I do this. To bring history in a more reasonable manner so that I'm not always just talking about my opinions on it. I give my opinions, but I inform my opinions as much as I can through the history that I share. When people take a narrative and then inform history on the narrative, it's not the history speaking, it is the narrative. He's also one of the few presidents and currently very needed future presidents who promised to only do one term. Polk was very successful. Yeah, definitely. Very successful president. Who's the most underrated president of U.S. history? Polk's up there. I'd say James Monroe or William McKinley. I hear that Mohammed had relations with a 9-year-old. You don't have to spam it. I would have responded anyway, Amit. But probably true. When you read history, you look from the point of view of your own country or from outsider. I try to look at history, any history of any nation, as an insider, as someone who lives in that country and what they would be thinking. The past is a foreign land with its own customs and cultures. Always remember that when you study history. In no way affiliated, so thank you so much. Enjoying the stream, please like and subscribe. Absolutely. Thank you, Harry, for sharing your opinion. Yeah, what else? Looking through the chat. If you have a question, please ask it. I'll take about 5 or 10 more minutes answering them, and then we're done. I'll see you again Friday and Saturday next week for the Q&A, and next Sunday's live stream lecture will be about ancient Greece. Was the blockade of Boston or crossing of the Delaware more influential in the American Revolution? The Europeans also brought gunpowder, whiskey, and gambling. Yeah, that doesn't sound as nice. So, but crossing of the Delaware, I'd say the crossing of the Delaware, the revolution would have completely collapsed if Washington had not done that. When you read history, you look from the point of... Oh, I already answered that. Do you think we can learn about history by looking at evolution of fashion and music? Absolutely. I mean, look at the flappers. Look at what they do in the 1920s. It's all because of women's rights. It's all because of suffrage. It's all because of that. League of Nations and income tax were a mistake. A lot of people think that way. But is the United Nations a mistake, Henry? Because really what Wilson envisioned was the United Nations. Hello from Germany. What do you say about Trump's new post about Chicago? I don't know. Did he make a new one? I'm not constantly paying attention to him. I'm not doing as much on my news updates daily just because it's so overwhelming, all the stuff that happens. I do news here in an objective fashion, but I'm just not going to go into huge amounts of information about it. I'm sure it was full of a lot of bluster and bravado. That's what he does. Thoughts on ancient Egypt surviving the Bronze Age collapse? I've said this before. I think I even answered you on that before, Ed. The Egyptian culture is transient. It is interchangeable depending on who is able to conquer and occupy that region. There is something very attractive about the status of the Egyptians, the power of the Nile, and their deep culture, their deep religion, their deep social stratification that allows them to endure. That's why the Greeks, when they conquered them, preferred to be Ptolemaic pharaohs than Greek kings. The Romans even saw themselves a little bit like this. It doesn't matter. Egypt has been able to survive all of these different collapses because of the richness of its society and the power of the Nile. The Egyptians are the most resilient society ever. Absolutely. Please define social history, social historians. Social history and social historians are focused on social trends and social issues to understand how history moves forward. Bring back the presidential train. That'd be fun. Trump on those trains, they'd be fun to watch. He would say a bunch of crazy stuff, but it'd still be funny. Do the Confederate States have a right to secede from the Union? I've heard people talk about this recently. Thank you for any clarification. Thank you for your attention to this matter, Jerry. No. The founders never envisioned states leaving on their own. Never. Nullification isn't in the mind of anyone who signed the Constitution. It's more of a George Mason thing. It's more of an anti-federalist thing. It's not you can make the argument that they were just hearkening back to the anti-federalists, but the anti-federalists lost and the Constitution was adopted, so they were living in the past. Is there a televised minutes silence on Thursday? Oh yeah. I don't know. Of course, it's the 24th anniversary of 9/11. I'll be posting my video that I have on that for you guys to watch from a year ago. But yeah, what do you think of Is it true that Texas divides it into 5 states? It could. That's what Texas does, I guess. What do you think of Pennsylvania being a proprietary colony instead of a normal crown colony? William Penn made all the difference. Decided to do it his own way, and decided to start and wanted it out from under the king so he could have what he believed to be a more godly society. Oh, this is a strange question. When did British colonizers become Americans? That's a fascinating question. I would say that the idea of American is part of what made the British colonizers settle in the 13 colonies originally. But there's something American about salutary neglect and many of their principles and ideas even before the American Revolutionary Movement. Officially 1776, but even before that's just the fulfillment of something that had been brewing and growing for a long time. Great question. Not a strange question at all. The North were the aggressors. Sovereign states' rights suspended centralized federal power. Then they formed their own country. They had their own government. That is called a revolution. If the Americans had their own revolution 90 years before or 85 years before for doing the same thing, then it applies to the Confederates and Jefferson Davis. Devil's advocate, the Founding Fathers never envisioned free men or women voting for or other future amendments. Very true. But when it came to creating a country, they didn't envision that country having the right to split up at different points. We will all hang together or we will all hang separate, is what I think Franklin said. Can you explain about how before the French Revolution, nationalism, way we know it did not exist? Nationalism existed as a cultural artifact, as an idea of shared cultural experiences like the German language. But the idea of a German nation really became part of their resistance to the Napoleonic invasion. It became American once everyone else started to immigrate to the United States and when Britain had annexed basically the entire French North and American Empire. So that'd be in the 1760s. And American immigration is something that has existed as long as America's been a country. Texas, for example, is proud of its 6 flags over Texas, which includes the Confederate flag. I think you can enjoy your history if it's problematic. Yes, but the Confederacy was a nation the United States destroyed in battle. Germans do not wave a Nazi flag for the same reason. The North were the aggressors. People, when Fort Sumter is mentioned, get quiet. Or the fact that Lincoln let Davis start the war. Or the fact that the South invaded the North first, if you actually look at it closely, at least if you're looking at the eastern side of the war. By the time America won its independence, it had nearly no emotional connection to the United Kingdom except your great-great-great, yeah. But it had, I wouldn't say it had no emotional connection. It had a salutary neglect. It had an idea of being British, but they just took British principles and reinterpreted them in their own context, and that became an American way of looking at things. Is it possible or legal for somehow to exist to divide into 5 states? I read an article about this once. Yeah, it is possible for a state to divide into multiple states. Sure. Thank you, Marcy. I really appreciate that. America gave Saddam chemical weapons to use against Iran, but he used them on his own people. Yep. America shooting itself in its foot with its Middle Eastern foreign policy. What a surprise. Mujahideen turns on you with Osama bin Laden. Why do you think it is called the American Revolution instead of American War of Independence? It's called both. Okay, hear me out. Anarcho-communism was tried in prehistory when we lived in nomadic and tribal. We were anarcho-communists and we decided it is not a good system. That is so anachronistic. You're basically being an anarcho-communist with your terminology if you're going to be that anachronistic. Because it isn't a revolution. They weren't trying to change their system of government. They were trying to create a whole new state and government. I kind of think that. It's definitely a more conservative revolution compared to what France did. They weren't trying to stay in the same country but change its government. That's more so Marx's perspective of primitive communism, but the ideas of anarcho-communism weren't really there. Yeah, I don't know. It's just so anachronistic. It's just Marx basically saying, see, this is communism. He did it with the New Testament, too. He said, see, people sharing things, communism. Compulsion by... They didn't have organized government. When you've got 8 people and you're trying to survive and you're deciding how to share goods, that's not communism. Marx envisioned that, but there was no arbitrator in those ancient societies for how to do that. And every single time communism has been tried, Marx envisioned no arbitrator, but that is totally impossible post any sort of social contract theory. So yeah, it's just Marx going back. And anarcho-communism is indeed a contradiction. What do you think of being able to smoke cow poo and still get high like Native Americans did? They do them. Why do people tend to look at the indigenous population as victims and their land stolen when they broke as many treaties and also were attacking settlements left and right? Because the critique of the West is a Western invention. It is a Western guilt complex. It's a Western historical guilt complex. And guilt complexes are popular. Why do you think... But I also think that the Native Americans died off in such large numbers that it's obviously easier to point to what Europeans and Americans did to them and the superior technology. The implicit notion, an argument, in look at the poor Native Americans who were slaughtered by the Americans, and the Brits did it in Canada and Australia. But here's the interesting thing. The implicit admission is that Western civilizations were technologically strong enough to be able to do that. That they're only in a the natives are only in a sympathetic position because they are such a technological and civilizational disadvantage compared to the Americans and the Brits and the French. And the Spanish. It's an interesting paradigm where you kind of have to accept the narrative that the West was in fact superior. But in order to have sympathy for the Native Americans, because they're basically being bullied. If you're going to treat them as fair and equal, which is almost impossible to do when you look at technology and history, then you do have to admit the Native Americans did plenty of this to each other. It's just in the scale of what it was done by the technology of the Europeans allowed it to be far more devastating, but you also have disease, which factored in the vast majority of the destruction of Native American civilization. Why do you think Islam grew and became so popular as fast as it did? Forced conversions, pressure from the jizya to not pay the jizya. Basically, if you want to live an equal lifestyle in a Muslim country in its early centuries, you would become a Muslim. If you want social mobility, you would become a Muslim. And the Muslim societies were rich enough to allow for social mobility during the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. But also the sword, you have conquest, and it's not like Christianity didn't do the same thing in some ways. That's more, let me see. So yeah, that's kind of where I go with that. Was American revolutionaries terroristic by technicality? Some of them were, some of them weren't. Sons of Liberty, definitely kind of a terrorist thing, and I'm not ashamed to say that. Well, anarcho-communism means sharing without state. That's such a bad terminology. Because the truth of the matter is that you have to have redistribution of wealth, no private property, and maybe some societies had notions of this, but it's not like they just indiscriminately shared and things held together. The Pilgrims tried this out, the Jamestown settlers tried this out. It didn't go anywhere. Europeans did smallpox. Humans are too hierarchical and power-hungry to ever be left to our own devices and be expected to naturally share evenly. That's like sharing chimpanzees not to fight, or baboons not to copulate. Yeah, very true. Bunnies, I guess you meant. Europeans didn't have a high-tech advantage. Natives didn't fight in line warfare like they did. Bows outperformed muskets until the 1800s. Partly true, not fully. By the time the United States gets there, the United States has a technological advantage. And you also have the civilizational advantage. It's easier to transport with the wheel. You've got, you have, you don't have as many men, but you have better weaponry. And you have settlements. You are less transient. You're more settled. You have supply lines. It's a lot easier for them than it is for the natives in many ways. Yeah, wait a minute. The birthright citizenship doesn't apply on Indians on reservations. I think it does, but they get dual citizenship. Reservations are considered their own territories, their own lands. AI will accelerate communism or at least democratic socialism. Interesting idea, maybe. I also believe that anarcho-capitalism was tried, but it evolved to feudalism. Anarcho-capitalism and laissez-faire capitalism are like communism, just in reverse. They've never really fully been tried because they are so impossible to actually apply. So you have more, not moderate, but you have more revised forms of them applied in circumstances where they are not supposed to be ideal, but even the ideal doesn't work. So they're so unworkable in ideal that applying them in a non-ideal situation is the only way you can do, and that also obviously leads to disaster, i.e. the Soviet Union. And laissez-faire economics has its own limitations, as you see with America in the late 19th century and the rise of the progressive movement. Yeah, that's true. The thing about Americans is they never stopped encroaching, like the Roman Empire. They lost battles but never lost wars because they never stopped coming. Basically, yeah. Same thing they did. They just kept throwing men and weapons at the Germans until the Germans surrendered. You could have a communist world but could not have a communist country. No, that's not true. And unless you want to kill hundreds of millions of people, then it's not true. By definition, you can't get a communist state because Marx did not believe in the idea of a country, so you can't have a textbook communist country. You can have socialist countries. Marx definitely believed in that. Communism is preceded by socialism in Marxist theory. Will it be accurate to say that nomadic lifestyle is closest thing to anarcho-communism? Kind of. But it's also the closest thing to anarcho-capitalism. You have ingenuity, innovation, things like that. Trade is obviously unrestricted. It's just you don't have a government, so it's almost impossible to say these things. Does feudalism exist in the modern day? Yes, but in more subtle forms than it used to. Well, capitalism doesn't have to be perfect to work, unlike communism. Communism wasn't perfect to begin with. Virginia became the 10th state on June 25th, 1788. Virginia split into Virginia and West Virginia around 1863. Thank you, Steve, for the fact of the day. I already knew that, but I appreciate you sharing that. West Virginia left because they didn't want to hold on to slaves. You think human and AI in a relationship is the future of dating? Yeah. I'm so hard up that I'm going to hit on a robot. I just don't understand. I think that using that as a way to fulfill base desires is possible, but I don't see that as an actual way of dating. If it does become an actual way of dating, then I'm going to be like Professor Farnsworth. What's the line? I don't want to live on this planet anymore. Yeah. Muslims did not burn the Library of Alexandria. Yeah. Asterisk. Do you think organized religion will die out in the 21st century? No. Organized religion is how people work with each other within a culture. When you want to say religion causes this and that, understand that religion is just the vehicle for humans to use their own ideas. And religions can advocate violence, but the enforcement of those violence is based completely on it. It's different from economic theories, which rely on implementation. Religion is an agreed-upon social set of beliefs, and can be manipulated at any point. Bros need to get off a computer. Completely agree. Slightly evolved feudalism. It's interesting. Communism always works out like that. Yes, you can have a totalitarian socialist state, but you cannot have what Marx would define as a communist state, because again, in his ideal world, there would be no countries. There'd be one communist state run by the workers, which is not only A, impossible, but also B, you would have a state, and it doesn't, other than the fact that it's impossible, it's the purest form of communism you can get, but the consequences of getting there, he knew, would mean violent revolution. So did Trotsky, so did Stalin. They all did. Well, Marx viewed the socialist state as a transitory state to communism. He didn't believe in immediate abolition. Right, and neither did Lenin and Stalin. And for all people try to do to separate Lenin and Stalin from Marx, they believed they were walking in lockstep with him. And for their context, based on the proportionality of their context proposed compared to Marx's context in industrialized Germany, they actually were communists. I'm not afraid to say that they were communists. They may not have been the most loyal to every single one of Marx's doctrines, but they had a practical situation that would not have allowed them to be true communists. If you're going to be that stingy about it, and I don't think you should be. That's like saying, so when people say that real communism has never been tried, that's like saying that laissez-faire capitalism is the only form of capitalism. So the people who complain about capitalism, who are socialists or communists today, and say real communism wasn't tried, don't understand that real capitalism, by that same standard, has never been tried, because you have adapted forms of capitalism. So it's a double standard that they do not want to answer to. You have adapted forms of capitalism that have had government intervention at certain times in history, or have had mitigating factors that have changed the way the market works and the way the free market operates. So those same people who say capitalism does this and does that, and have never, well, why are you hating on capitalism? No, they weren't real capitalists, is what you could easily say to that argument. It's as stupid as, I mean, I would say corporatism, monopolies are not really capitalistic, and Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, although Wilson was less of a capitalist than Roosevelt, would agree with me. So, if Britain and the rest lost the Great War, would there have been a Third World War, as you call it? Maybe. I don't know. It would have depended on Germany's bloodlust. Everything depends on German bloodlust. Is as dogmatic as some religions, in my opinion, so you could argue that's religion-like. It's replacing religion. It's taking religion out and replacing it with an economic system. I'm never tired to see friendly history, and I'm never tired to see you here, Omar. Will history look kindly on the area we currently live in? People look too kindly on histories from long ago that were full of horrible things. So I'd like to think that idealism and optimism went out when it comes to history, so yes. Stalin was not who was wanted by Lenin to take over. Lenin hated the fact... No, he didn't. Lenin had no idea who to take over. He did not like Trotsky, and he did not like Stalin. He didn't envision either of them taking over. He wanted kind of the party base to run the organization, but by the time he died, he realized he had been hoodwinked by Stalin, but he'd also realized he'd been hoodwinked by Trotsky. I love this, we must separate Lenin from Stalin. No. Just because they didn't like each other means very little. Mao and Brezhnev hated each other, and they both caused untold amounts of suffering for people. You can still be a bad historians do this, left-wing historians especially do this, in a way to make Stalin look like this crazy, out of a normal person, and Lenin and being the good guy, and Trotsky being the good guy. The brutality of all three men is well-established historical fact. The fact that they didn't personally like each other has very little to do with that. Hitler and Stalin didn't like each other. They caused untold amounts of suffering for untold amounts of people. Communist Vietnamese, who made the South Vietnamese suffer after kicking the Americans out in 1975, went into Pol Pot's Cambodia and threw him out of power. Communists have no problem hating each other. Marxism has a prophet, Marx, a holy book, Das Kapital, and all of these figures are really romanticized and they believe in utopia. A little bit. Because while he was not in one of the big fancy positions that everyone wanted, he was in the perfect position to get power over time and seize power when the leader died. That's true. Stalin was extremely opportunistic. Look at Snowball and Animal Farm. Corporatism is just fascism. It's not capitalism. It wasn't true capitalism is what you're saying. Let me see. Capitalism is the headless snake. Interesting theory. Okay. Today's capitalism. Let's go. Oh, geez. Lenin and Stalin were both authoritarian schizos nonetheless, both terrible answers to the Tsar's weak and oversightful rule. Well, the Tsar himself was not schizophrenic, but a terrible ruler. Lenin's biggest mistake was trusting Bolsheviks. Lenin was the founder of the Bolsheviks. It was Trotsky who became a Bolshevik. If history is written by the winners, then why does it look like that in the Crusades losers wrote the history? Because most history in the West is written by Westerners. What do you think of the Indus Valley civilization being communist because of no good evidence of social elites or stratification? That's so ridiculous. To say that means communism is shooting the arrow and then drawing the target. Have you heard of? You meet one criterion. That doesn't mean you meet every single criterion. Have you heard of Wagtranas Papun? I have no idea what you're talking about, GTI. Lenin hoodwinked the Russians and Stalin hoodwinked Lenin. Checkmate Stalin. That's a very, very good way to put it. And Trotsky was going to hoodwink a lot more people. Even Lenin realized how maniacal Trotsky was. People look at Trotsky as this romanticized figure. Don't ask what he did to the soldiers, to the Navy men at Potemkin, on Battleship Potemkin. It's pretty nasty what he did. Some of the things he did at Petersburg and with the Red Army are pretty... I mean, who knows how many people would have died under Trotsky. What do you think of the film Death of Stalin? I really want to watch it, but I'm not sure if it's going to be accurate. I haven't seen it. I should watch it. Hitler took too big a bite and too fast. Definitely true when he invaded Russia. Let me see here. What was the difference between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks? The Mensheviks believed in a gradual Marxist adaptation, and the Bolsheviks believed in an immediate violent revolution. Death of Stalin is a vaguely accurate fit, but it's a comedy, so remember it tries to be really funny over accuracy. Sure. Yeah, the Mensheviks do sound like a cake at Jewish Passovers. Don't mention Jews and Bolsheviks, because then, Simon, I'm going to have to be talking about it forever. When and how America went from isolationism to manifest destiny, what made it so popular? Isolationism and manifest destiny went hand in hand. It's World War I or World War II. It's this kind of stuff that brought America into the fold of worldwide influence and interest. I'm trying to catch up to the chat. Hello, George Washington. No, I think it's because he was murdered. People who get murdered get a lot of goodwill. That's fair, too. Yeah, Trotsky got murdered by Stalin. So did Lev Kamenev. So did Bukharin. So did a bunch of other nasty guys. None of these people would you want to be. You would not want to be in a room with any of these people unless they were trying to wow you or get something from you. And I'm not. And I know I bash communism a lot, and it's only because I know about history. So there you go. I bash fascism too, and fascism and communism are not that different. As a person with my own political views, I believe in the spectrum. When it comes to history, I believe in the horseshoe. Yeah, don't be brain. I mean, I cannot believe it. I mention the Bolsheviks every time I do, and without fail, there's someone who's saying, and the Bolsheviks were all Jews, right? I'm like, yes, many of the Bolsheviks were Jews. So was Einstein and Jesus. So what? Hitler would have beaten Russia had he waited until he was done with the campaign through Western Europe. Probably. But that's like saying the Kaiser would have beaten France if he had not invaded Russia. Which is, again, where we were today. Stalin probably did die in his own pee or poop. People that die release all the things when they die. Yeah, that's just, who cares? That doesn't matter that much to me. Have you read the book, The Leaf of Left and Right? No, but I should. Yes, but in the 18th century, how did Americans went from isolationism and washing towards manifest destiny? It wasn't isolationism to take land from Native Americans. Those are categorically different things. The myth of right and left, of left and right. Oh yeah, I've heard of that book. I haven't read it. I have an entire Substack article. You guys can read Substack articles of mine if you don't like the sound of my voice, but like my thoughts on where the left and right actually come from and how to properly understand them in historical context. What are Jews or religion? Taylor, I'm assuming you're asking in good faith because I've never seen you before. This will be the last question I answer, by the way. We've gone way, way over time. We're almost at 6 p.m. Eastern. But the Jews are an ethnic group. Judaism is the religion they practice. Thucydides is the first historian. Russian communism killed 70 million people. Probably closer to 30, but yeah, pretty bad. It's at that number, it's just not fathomable. Just like the Holocaust or Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge. Was there an alternative path where manifest destiny peacefully took empty land and had a good relationship with Native Americans? No. The natives weren't going to just abandon land. Do you agree that this terms of left and right and conservative and liberal do more harm than good? It's divisive, but it's not. It's divisive, but it's not ineffectual. You have to be called something. Why do you think the Jews have been so persecuted throughout history? From Roman Empire, medieval Europe, Germany, Russia, Soviet Union, you may seem to single them out. They're successful. They follow all the cultural markings of their ancient Jewish religion, and many of their social behaviors breed success. Economic success, investment in the proper fields. The Russian Revolution, some have argued, was caused because of an exodus of Russian Jews, which destabilized the Russian economy. And they don't integrate, and in Europe, that's mainly because they were accused of killing Christ rather than serving him. So there you go. Do you believe in the political horseshoe? I don't. When I vote, when I think about my own political opinions and my own political climate, I don't believe in the horseshoe. I believe in the spectrum. But when I look at history, I believe in the horseshoe. I think that there's a lot of evidence that Hitler was a socialist. And I think there's a lot of evidence that Stalin acted like a fascist. I think you could make a very sound argument. So, yeah. Anyways, thank you. Like and sub. Of course, I love my subscribers. Thank you for this really great conversation and everything you guys asked. Yeah. You also go up and down. That's fair. Joshua said, I'm glad Hitler decided there would have been a war on two fronts because otherwise. Very true. I don't know. The French still speak German, so don't say that argument. How people can believe, tolerate existing communism as a remedy to their problems. Whole South America is swept by communism. Because of the oppression and imperialism of the West, they see capitalism as the enemy. That's why communism was popular in South America, and Africa, respectively. Anyways, yeah, let's see if we get three or four more likes in the last couple of seconds. I'm going to sign off. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Jerry. It's my pleasure. Love all of my subscribers. Make sure to like and subscribe. Consider becoming a member if you want to get early access and extra videos. Anything you give to this channel helps us grow, so we really appreciate all of the great questions and the great conversation we had about Woodrow Wilson. Favorite alternative history scenario? Let's just go with today's. What had happened if the Americans didn't join the Second World War? But anyways, one is nationalist, the other internationalistic, kind of, but they are both radical socialistic authoritarian systems to some extent. All right, take care. Have a great week. We'll see you back here Friday, 6 p.m. Eastern. Check out the long form videos Mondays and Fridays at 8 p.m. Eastern, and our shorts that are on every day. Check out our TikTok for extra bonus content, and follow us on Instagram for updates. Thank you. I really appreciate that, Thomas. You are very, very kind. I didn't talk about the British Empire by anyone. Well, Harry, you did a great job today. I really appreciate you. And Harsh, wherever you're watching this from, just know that we still value you and love your opinion on Woodrow Wilson, even if I don't happen to share that opinion. We've gotten over the Woodrow Wilson hump, and we answered a bunch of questions. So today was extraordinarily successful. One of our livest live streams. Thank you for hanging in there. Show some love to my moderators and everything they do on the way out. They did a great job today. Make sure to take care. Have a great week, and remember, as always. Sorry, Jude, you just missed our live stream lecture about Woodrow Wilson. You're going to have to go back and rewatch it. I also have a long-form video on Woodrow Wilson and an entire series on the president and a tier ranking video on the president. Please go watch all of that. It'd be really, really appreciate. Simon, if you can ever do that, find the link to the video during the live stream and plug it in. That would help, but I know that's a lot, so no pressure if you can't do it. But yeah, that guy, the one. We talked about the Second World War. Yes, we did, Kevin. All right. Have a great one, everybody, and as always, love history. Bye-bye now.